Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, my name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming at the Center for Fiction. And it's our huge honor to host the Grist tonight. Their project is so wonderfully aligned with our mission, which is to support the creation and enjoyment of fiction, and to recognize fiction as foundational power of the imagination. And the way that they're using it is so inspiring. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for this evening from Grist, Tori Stevens. Please welcome him to the stage.
Thank you. All right. I have two. These are both on. Hello, everyone. Sorry for the troubles, but so glad that everyone's here. My name is Tori Stevens. I am the creative manager of climate fiction at Grist. I manage the Imagine 2200 project that you probably know a little bit about. And one thing you probably don't know is that NRDC has been a sponsor of this project for 3 years. They like really early on the project. They were like, this is alignment. This is something we like. This is something we want to get involved in and partner. So they've sponsored us and helped us for 3 years now. And so just want to talk about them a little bit so that you all know who NRDC is. That's the National Resource Defense Council. They run a program called Rewrite the Future. Folks over there are awesome. They're the ones that really helped us by sponsoring this and saw the alignment. Their initiative is a sponsor of this event. Rewrite the Future enlists the power of storytelling in film and television and literature to help combat the climate crisis. This initiative aims to increase climate-related content in popular culture to inspire and engage diverse audiences in solving the climate crisis together. So you can learn more about them at nrdc.org/rewrite the future. So also want to tell you about Grist, the organization I work for. Grist is a nonprofit, independent media organization dedicated to highlighting climate solutions and uncovering environmental injustices and highlighting the justice aspects that are out there in climate as well. In the past 2 years, Grist garnered nearly 60 awards and nominations, including, this one was big in the office, the National Magazine Award for General Excellence, 5 Online Journalism Awards, and 2 Edward R. Murrow Awards. Last year, our work reached millions of people every month and influenced policy at the federal, state, and local levels. Using the power of storytelling, Grist illuminates the way forward to a better world, which is similar to what Imagine does in the fiction space, and inspires millions of people and shows that the time for action around climate is now. And so we're committed to this. This is something that Grist has been doing. It's been around for 25 years. I don't think a lot of people know that. So we've been focused on the climate for 25 years, which is quite amazing, and a big reason for why I decided to move over to working there. So now I want to introduce the project Imagine 2200. Imagine 2200 is a project that's focused on getting writers and readers to envision the future that we want, the one that we all deserve. We want to get to a clean, green, and just future. And the way that we primarily do that is through a contest. We publish stories, but the main way that we get these stories is by activating the public globally to submit stories to us. We have a prompt that's out there in the world. The prompt is actually going to be put out there in the world again for the 4th time on the 28th of this month. So sourcing stories from everywhere. Just to give you a scale, we're getting about 1,000 stories a year. These are short stories that are anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 words. So really just trying to motivate people to think about this beautiful future that we all want. And so we started this in the pandemic and had a beautiful visioning session that helped us kind of figure out what kind of climate fiction we want at Grist. And the things that we're looking for is cultural authenticity in our stories. These are global stories, so we want global voices, and we want those to feel rich, authentic, and real, especially to the people that live in those cultures. The other piece that we're looking for is these stories are hopeful. Some people have called them utopian. I wouldn't call all of them utopian, but we're certainly happy when we get a utopian story. But there's like a new term out of the UK that it describes a lot of our stories as through-topia. So they're kind of showing the way, how do we get to that beautiful green space? And we have some stories that are fully formed utopias, but others that are kind of showing, how do you get there? What steps is it going to take for us to get there? And then intersectional characters. We want rich, layered characters that their identities are not end up on the cutting room floor. It's not all world building and no people. It's like people, characters first. That's something that we're committed to and quite love. I would also say this project has won 2 awards too in its short 3-year history. So now I'm going to introduce the panelists. We have Paolo Galupki, sorry, I totally butchered that. He's an international best-selling author of speculative fiction. Paolo is joining us virtually from his home in Colorado. We were having some trouble with having him up on the screen, kind of like his video. So that's what we were working on, and that's why it took us a little time. He will be on audio, so you'll be able to hear him respond to questions. So Paolo, oh, there he is. Okay. All right. So we do have him. All right. Yay. Magic. When it works, it works. So I should also mention that, so we've had judges every year, and Paolo is one of the judges for this year. We also have Sam Miller. He's an award-winning author whose books have been called must-reads and best of the year. Sam Miller, if you could come on stage. Sam was also one of our esteemed judges as well for this year. And then we also have one of the authors who submitted a story, and their story came in as a finalist. When we get those 1,000 stories, we only publish 12 a year. We have a huge review process where we have folks reading 40 stories a week, and there's a rubric and everything. And Lavinia Summers is from Brooklyn, which I forgot to say how much I love Brooklyn. I'm going to deviate for a second. I from Boston. I grew up in Boston, but I used to come down to New York all the time. And in Brooklyn, in New York, I would get my brain was activated in a different way than it was in Boston. Like, it's not as cool, it's not as hip. Like,
I wasn't gonna
like
say
sneakers, this place is chill, and I'm not just gassing you up because I'm here. Like, truly, like, my brain, like, the creative energy that I got from, like, kind of seeing the individuality and like the art, the culture, all that really sparked some of the creative things that I've brought to this project. So I wanted to say that earlier, but I had forgotten. And so Lavinia Summers, who wrote a story. Lavinia Summers is a Brooklynite based climate nerd, excited about imagining a just regenerative future. She works in renewable energy and writes sci-fi stories to bring that future into reality. And so I guess we'll get into it now. I have my trusty binder so I don't mess things up. And I'll start with my first question. What role does creative fiction, or climate fiction, play in designing our futures? Do you think climate fiction and climate storytelling can help us get to a green, clean, and just world? I'll start with you, Lavinia.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me up on this stage. It's a little surreal being on the same space as 2 very accomplished authors, but thank you. And I think the short answer would be yes. I think there is obviously a role. I guess for me, I work in the climate space. My coworkers are in the front row. Hi. And so much of the work we do is focused on getting the next policy passed, or the next program done, or the next project deployed, and that's all very important. And I think climate fiction kind of offers a complement to that, in that I think most of the stories I read in the Grist 2200 collection were focused on the relationships that we build with each other, how we relate to people in the future, how we relate to our planet in the future. So it kind of opens up the question of what is a climate solution. It's not just the tech and the projects, it's also the relationships that we build, and I think that's important.
Well, I would follow up and just ask, like, how does your work that you do during the day show up
Oh
in your
boy.
climate fiction?
That's the test question. Now I'm gonna get graded on this tomorrow. I don't know. I think it's like definitely inspired. It's cool to see like some of the solutions that we talk about at work and figure out how they can play into, I guess, yeah, some of the stories that I come up with. But I think I I write these stories because I'm so invested in it, and I think yeah, being able to have the space to both like put so much energy in the work that I do day to day, working in the climate tech space, and then also like be able to process all the emotions that come with like
Right.
working in the climate space. Having climate fiction there is a really helpful balance. So
Yeah, that's a theme. I was just at Aspen Ideas, and there was a really great panel on the same question. And this idea of like being able to emotionally play in that space as opposed to solving it from like a tech point of view. So
yeah.
I really appreciate that question. Paulo, I'm going to go to you. I hope you can hear me. And same question to you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So same question to you. What role do you think that climate fiction and climate storytelling, do you think it can play a role in getting us to a clean, green, and just future?
I think it's a necessary thing. One of the things about our ability to move forward is that we have to be able to imagine what we want to get to, and I feel like fiction has this opportunity to sort of plant flags further and further ahead of us that allow us to sort of think about where we want to get to. We don't necessarily have to know the details of how to get there, but we have to know where we want to get to. And once you have that sort of goal out there, once you have that destination, then people can start filling in those internal details. I think in terms of like science fiction, that when we write about future, that there's this long history of sort of technological sort of innovation following the imagination of authors, and I feel like the climate space, the climate fiction space, is another one of those spaces where ideally it's a rich opportunity.
Great, thanks so much. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that narrative is everything when it comes to social change. I spent 15 years working as a community organizer on issues of housing policy and police reform, and doing like a lot of really hard work with a lot of cool organizations, fighting on like really urgently needed problems, and fighting against a sort of narrative of like, people understand these issues and they think they understand it as like, oh, it's your fault if you're homeless, or, oh, the police have tough jobs, so if they behave badly, that's, there's a few bad apples, right? And it wasn't until those narratives started to change and we started to be able to shift the conversation and some events happened in the public sphere that helped people to understand the injustice differently that we started to see legislation passed that we had spent years fighting for. So I do think that like, while it's important, like really important to be like, protesting and calling your senator and doing all the things to fight for change, it is also really important to help people reimagine a narrative, right? Because a lot of people have a narrative in their heads of like, we're already fucked, the climate, it's too late to fix things, like what's the point, the system is too big, and helping people reimagine their own power and agency is really important.
You also talked about things that I would say that some people would think is like adjacent to climate. You talked about the police. You talked about protesting and whatnot. Like we often see in the stories that we publish that sometimes climate will be the third thing in the story that the character cares about because they're dealing with other issues. How do you see that showing up in the climate fiction? Do you add intersectional kind of moments and events and characters to your stories?
Yeah, I mean, everything is intersectional. You can't tease out patriarchy from racism, from economic injustice, from housing instability, from the sort of like big picture, capitalism creating a climate crisis. So to me, stories feel true and alive when they are connected, when it's talking about issues as complex and messy and embodied in complex, messy people. So that's what I like as a reader, and yeah, that's what I try to do as a writer.
Nice. I'm going to move on to my second question. Why have you chosen to write climate fiction? Were you always a climate fiction writer, or did you make your way here? I'll start with you, Paulo, because you're online.
All right. Yeah, I found my way into climate fiction pretty early on in my career. It was I was already working for an environmental organization called High Country News. They're an environmental journal. And I was just sort of building my, I don't know, writing chops at the same exact time. I had a lot of friends who were science and environment journalists. And so the stuff that they were sort of churning up in the course of their reporting then became material for me, where they were sort of reporting on the ground and seeing some change. So a friend of mine, Michelle Nyhouse, would be writing about global warming. And there's only so far a science journalist can take that story. They say, okay, we're looking at beetle kill. We're seeing beetles move into regions that we haven't seen them hit before. But, what happens in 100 years? Where does that go? And suddenly that was a really rich space for me to work in, where it was like, okay, let's take this and let's extrapolate from this and build outward. And so that ended up forming a vast amount of my career. I ended up writing young adult fiction based in that space. I ended up writing adult fiction based in that space. And it, especially at that time, it felt like I had a lot of room to maneuver. There weren't a lot of people doing similar work. I kept sort of looking over my shoulder and expecting somebody else to steal my next story. I was like, wait, I'm reading this in the newspaper. Why isn't somebody else writing about this? And it was sort of like, it actually was this sort of vast open space. And you're sort of standing there going, okay, well, I'll take it then. And that was the case for a long time, it felt like. And then, over time things have changed, but that was like all of my career and all of my creative life for, almost 15 years or something, maybe more. And yeah, it's and I burned out. I've since more recently shifted gears, actually, just because in contrast, I think maybe to Lavinia, I feel like my having my creative life and my I guess my personal sort of anxieties both mashed together ended up being sort of a destructive cyclone instead of a purgative space, which it had been at one point. It had been a place where I could set my anxieties, and instead it became a space where I was amplifying my anxieties instead.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I definitely get some climate anxiety, and actually the books and stories that I'm reading help me with that anxiety. And it's kind of weird because I don't get what is a typical anxiety, or I have family members that have anxiety, but the climate one really, I don't know. And the whole idea that it's an existential crisis for humanity, it kind of just gets me in a weird space. So I totally get where you're coming from. If there wasn't that, I would not have some anxiety. So you've shifted your work a little bit. So are you, just because I want to learn a little bit about that, and folks are here to kind of learn a little bit what you're up to. What are you doing these days?
So I completely burned out, and then ended up falling into fantasy. Okay. And I ended up writing a whole sort of novel, and now probably it's going to be a series of novels set in sort of an Italian Renaissance-like world, with a little bit of magic and lots of intrigue and politics and poisonings and stuff. And one of the things about it that was sort of interesting to me and felt almost, I don't know, almost illicit, was that in this world, as I was working on it, there would be these assumptions that I would make about the world, like, oh, yes, the glaciers of the Cielo Frigo, they never melt. And, so the high frozen wastelands are stable. And I felt like I was like a bad person for sort of making pretend like this. And it was it was a really strange thing to have that kind of come up in my head and suddenly feel like, am I even allowed to do this? Is this okay? Like, far more than writing a sex scene, writing like about unfrozen glaciers. Like, I was just like, oh my God, this is bad. Like, am I okay? Like, so, yeah.
All right. Well, how about you, Lavinia? I'll just read the question. I'll just read the question for you again. Why have you chosen to write climate fiction? You did answer this to some degree in your answer before, but maybe you can expound upon that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I'm pretty new to this. I started writing maybe seriously like during the pandemic. And that was because it was the pandemic. I was in grad school learning about environmental issues. Everything was just like generally depressing. And so I think I just needed to write or to see stories where everything started out like crap, and then over time they got better and improved, and then maybe were even amazing. And writing that was kind of like a process of working through all of those emotions and the need to see those types of stories. So I also, I think, like, have started out with climate fiction. I really like sci-fi, just like any type of story that questions our current reality and our current like world economic order and pushes on the bounds of that a little bit. But yeah, I think looking back at some of the specifically like climate fiction stories, they always are like, wow, this was pretty crap. And then there was a process, and we got somewhere beautiful. So yeah.
Yeah, and so you're talking about writing like hopeful climate fiction, which is why you ended up attracted to the call that we put out there. I often get letters and emails from emails from folks, and writers say that it's harder to write hopeful fiction. And I wanted, you write all different kinds of fiction. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that is true? That it's harder, or is it just a muscle that you have to kind of train?
I don't know. I feel like, I guess I grew up with stories that felt like, I don't know, we talked about this a little bit, just like I grew up with, my mom is Jamaican, she read me Nancy the Spider. I grew up with like these stories of mythical creatures in really difficult circumstances who have to outwit a larger opponent, and like kind of viewed them as metaphors for like Black people surviving slavery and colonialism. So this idea of like stories that were instructional on how to be hopeful, I think, is something that I've carried with me, and felt like writing those types of stories was very necessary. So I guess having that as a background and like foundation made it a little less hard. And then also, I don't know, I just feel like Black people are really good at having a lot of fun in really crappy situations sometimes. Like, right. Like the story that I wrote for this was based on Carnival in Jamaica, which is like one of my favorite events and just such a joyful experience. So I wanted to bring that to climate fiction. Yeah, I don't know. I'll stop there.
All right. Yeah, and the stories that have that cultural piece are stories that end up in our collection. Last year we published a Jamaican woman who had used a lot of patois in the story, and it's really beautiful to kind of see that show up in as like language. And she described it as being like, I was very nervous to kind of submit because I thought you might not want this kind of, and that's exactly what we want. So appreciate that. Yeah, how about you? What brought you to climate fiction? Do you plan on staying? Does it give you anxiety? Or does it help you with if you have any anxiety?
Yeah, everything gives me anxiety. Most of what I write, the kernel is something that I'm angry about, or sad about, or grieving, or what am I struggling to understand about the world? What is the thing that I'm upset about? And so often, things like mass extinction and environmental collapse, all of these things are things that like I really grieve and struggle to find my way around, like living in a world where not only that's happening, but in some sense like it's on us, like we like have agency and power to do something about it. So trying to navigate that, trying to make sense of that, and so often that takes the form for me of like, what's a story I can tell where there might be a solution or a way out, or like to me, so I don't want an ending. Endings don't need to be happy, but they need to be just. Like, I feel like justice is this thing that doesn't exist in the real world, but that can exist in fiction and in storytelling. And so if I can like tell a story where like the guilty are punished, that can be like really gratifying, and that can make me feel like safe and happy in a way that like the reality of the climate crisis and the culpability of like, oil company executives and billions of other people, doesn't, goes unpunished. So yeah, I'm pissed. That's the short answer.
I think a
That's
lot
what
of us
drives me to
are,
climate
so
fiction.
that tracks well with me. All right, so how about let's talk about culture, because that's what we were talking about and it's so important to the project. Culture and identity being something that drives us to create these kind of stories. How does that show up in your stories? Is it something just as central for you as anger?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot of my stories center queer community and queer characters. And like, I wrote a novel called Blackfish City that takes place in sort of like a far future post-climate collapse, floating city in the Arctic. And there was like, all of the main characters are some variety of queer. And there was like a reviewer who was like, I don't understand how this world is so overpopulated when everybody is queer. Which is, delightfully ignorant on a number of levels. So yeah, like being able to like, imagine futures for us and imagine what like community and culture might look like is part of my work. But also like as a reader, the narratives that, really ignite me and get me excited are often the ones that have that element of like something really vivid, like Lavinia's story and like Paolo's The Wind-Up Girl.
Right. Paolo, how about you? Do you want to talk about culture and identity and how it moves you and how you incorporate it in story?
Sure. So one of the things that you're doing when you're writing, any story is that you're trying to find your way into the sort of the embedded lives of the people who are experiencing the story. And that, that comes from this sort of layers of landscape. It comes from layers of resources. It comes from layers of history. And when I worked on something like The Water Knife, which was about drought in the Southwest, there were things that were very easily drawn from my own experiences because I grew up in Western Colorado. I understand how Western water law works. My family had a farm. We have irrigation canals. We understand that the water gets shut off when the snow isn't thick in the mountains, that you could look up and see the mountain and see exactly what you're going to get this year. There's things that like come directly from your, inherent experience. And then there's that moment when you sort of go imagining and you go further. And, when I was working on something like Wind-Up Girl, my background is that I had been a Chinese language major and done a lot of East Asian studies work and lived and worked in China a lot. And I ended up setting a story in Thailand. And one of the reasons why was because Thailand had such a rich history of resistance against Western imperialism, one of the few countries in Southeast Asia that sort of held on to its sovereignty. And that was a good metaphor for what I wanted to do in terms of talking about the encroachment of biotechnology and corporate control of food. And so suddenly you're like, oh, well, I know a lot about China, but I don't know enough about Thailand. And so, off you go researching to like try to figure out what you need to know about what the lived life of this place is. And some of that relates to what you've already learned about other countries, about your own life, but also, deep into the specifics of this particular country. And so you end up going there and you end up asking lots of questions and you end up bumping into things that you're unexpected. And it changes the story and builds the story for you because you learned more things.
Yeah, again, I get a lot of letters. And folks often ask, like, I'm not from this culture. how do I show up? How do I like bring in characters that are not from the culture that I grew up in? And I have a few answers for that. And I think like one of them Paulo talked about, which is you're gonna have to research the hell out of that, because you really want to show up in a way that someone from that culture looks at this and goes, that feels true to me. And like the way you do that more than research is by having folks in your life that are from that culture, or maybe visit a place, to help out with that as well. And so I asked you that question. You talked about culture and like, how that influenced you, like your background and like the stories. You have this beautiful story around, like I felt like I was in the Caribbean, like the smells, how do you bring that to life? Like, is that just innate? Is that something or did you also research the hell out of that?
Oh, I'm way too lazy for research. No. Yeah, I don't know. I felt like it was just describing feelings that, like an image or a feeling that I wanted to convey with those stories. Or yeah, I guess with that scene. I don't know that it was, I don't know. Like this story in particular, I think came from a daydream, and so I had a very specific like image that I wanted to write down.
Okay.
And kind of just started like word vomiting it out, and then went back painfully and was like tuning it. I felt like I was tuning an instrument. Like sometimes it was like a little flat, a little sharp, and then finally you get the pitch that you're looking for, and that feels really good. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just a fun practice. I'm not sure I can add too much more to that. Sorry.
That's okay. I would definitely say writing a 3,000 to 5,000 word story is not lazy. Like it takes a lot of effort and time, and you like owned it and like ended up as one of the 12, which I think is amazing.
Thanks.
I think like one of the things that I think for me has been really enlightening about this whole project is being in touch with writers. So we're in touch with close to 3,000 writers. They send me letters, and we often, there's all practical questions that we're trying to field, and I don't always have the answers. So I think for this moment we can transition to talking about craft a little bit. And so yeah, like you want to talk about like where do your ideas come from? That was the Boston ideas come from, and like what's your process for beginning a story?
I mean,
Sam.
a lot of it does come down to like what's a thing I'm upset about, but it's more than that. It's usually just like I have thousands of story molecules bouncing around in my head of like, wouldn't it be cool if there was a person who had this superpower? Or wouldn't it be cool to set a story in this 19th century setting that I read a cool book about? And so they are bouncing around, and once in a while two will like collide and form like a molecule. And then that's usually where like a story starts to happen, as opposed to like scattered ideas. And so when that starts to cohere around a theme or a thing I'm mad about. But yeah, often it's like very mysterious of like, I don't know, Tori, it just happened. It was there. It was there.
Lots of stickies, like writing in a notepad, like what's your kind of, lot of notepads? Yeah. And on the go or at home?
All over the place. And also I'm a big fan of my new discovery is Simple Note, which is an app that is just like text-based notes, and I just have been transcribing all of my billions of notebooks into that and then using it, and then you can like add metadata to like gather things that are like, oh, here's all the things that I've been anxious about like thinking about the Russian Revolution and superpowers, and there now story.
Okay. How about you, Lavinia?
Yeah, I guess just like, sorry, about craft and everything.
Yeah, like, where does your story idea start from? Then how do you like, pull that together and then move it from being an idea to a story?
I think very similar. Anger is like a great place to start. And then using a story or a scene to work through that anger. I don't know that the end result is always justice for me. Sometimes it's just like, well, things got better a little bit. But yeah, starting with that feeling for sure. I write a lot in Google Docs on the train. I don't know why, but that's like, I think having a lot of noise around me is like, well, you can't have, there's no noise for like the self-critique. So like, just go.
Nice.
Okay.
And then like having little snippets of scenes that maybe are working through an emotion. and then at some point putting those scenes together maybe, or figuring out if there's a story behind it or a character or a place I'd want to explore more. But it usually just starts with like I'm really annoyed about something and want to write through it, and we'll use this character or this scene or this situation to like transpose all of that somewhere.
Right. Paulo, how about you?
Yeah, I think that like I feel like I have some stories that are more like found stories, and then some stories that are more like constructed stories. So a lot of times, one of the things that you're sort of wondering about is like what's worth spending time immersing in, what's worth time spending, what are you going to waste a certain amount of trees to make books out of? And so like when I was working on Waterknife, I was trying to figure out what project I was going to work on next, and there was a point where I was down in Texas in like 2011 during one of their major droughts, and they were having terrible effects. They were just having rolling brownouts because their electricity was going out because their reservoirs were too low, so they didn't have hydraulic head. They were having to put their cattle down. They were having record numbers of 100-degree days. All of these things were happening, and at the same exact time, the governor of Texas, was Rick Perry at that time, was going around urging people to pray for rain. Yes. and that struck me as being interesting. There was that disconnect between looking at what climate science said is a likely future for Texas, and it looks a lot like this 2011 drought, and then a Politico who's saying, let's pray our way through this. And so that disconnect between facts coming at you and magical thinking being the salvation, that struck me as being interesting enough to go after. So there's the node where you're like, okay, there's something about magical thinking. There's something about climate change that I want to talk about. Those things matter. Okay, now what? And then there was an actual construction process where I said, okay, so I'm going to talk about climate change. I'm really going to write this. Where am I going to do it? And so then I was like, I think I'm going to do this in the Southwest because I understand the environmental issues there. Okay. What am I going to do? I'm going to have Phoenix be a place that's not planning and is engaged in magical thinking. I'm going to have Las Vegas be a place that's planning and aggressively sort of protecting their future. Now I'm going to create characters. And how do we illustrate characters that are going to give us enough windows into what's going on in this world? And so one of them is going to be some like Angel Velasquez, who's going to be a water knife who blows up other people's water treatment plants and steals water. So you have an action, aspect, but you also have sort of a driving philosophy of zero sum water solutions. We got ours, too bad for you. There's going to be a journalist, and she's going to give you kind of an overview, and you're going to get an understanding of the larger sort of perspectives because she can interview people. She has an intellectual understanding. So there's another entry character. And then there's going to be somebody like Maria, and she's a climate refugee out of Texas. And she's going to give you the sense of like what it's like to be a climate loser, somebody who's already had your home destroyed and to go somewhere else and try to be surviving in a new place. And that's going to be sort of an angle for both understanding consequences and also maybe engaging empathy about what it means and how vulnerable we are. And then you start building story from that. And so that in that particular case, it was an entirely very deliberately constructed object to generate a set of outcomes for the reader and experiences for the reader.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say it sounds like you're using character to tell the story, the different characters in a really thoughtful manner to kind of tell the story from different angles and perspectives. And
you are always looking for the right attack on a concept. Like, there's like, and a lot of times, like the work that I'll do where I'm trying to figure out, like, who am I going to write about? What is it? That's the process. Is you write, 5 different characters, and none of them give you the angle or the feeling or the lived-in experience that you're looking for, or the pathos or the humanity or whatever. And then eventually, maybe somebody comes into being. And I think that part is more the discovered aspect. Lots of characters of mine are lying on the cutting room floor because they never sort of fully came to life. But yeah, without those characters and without those attack angles, you can't actually illustrate the story, and you can't actually engage a reader. And, your job as a writer is always to engage. It's always to seduce with story and then tell more.
Thanks for that. I guess I'll stick with craft for a bit. We talked about an idea and bringing that to fruition and turning it into a story. What advice would you offer up to, so we have a lot of folks, it runs the gamut, the kind of writers that we get who submit stories, folks that are emerging writers, folks that have never submitted a story in their entire life, and then others who have won Emmys. What advice would you give to folks that are writing the next Imagine 2200 story? I'll go with you, Sam.
Yeah, just read a lot. Like, that's my advice for every writer, right? Like, just read a lot. Like, there's so much out there. You should know what you love. You should know what you hate. You should see what gets you excited. You should see what's happening on the frontiers and fringes of the field, and trust your gut of like what makes you excited, and what are the stories you want to tell. What are the stories that get you jazzed up to tell stories? Just like a lot of advice I could give, but read a lot is the
okay. Well, let's stick with that. So when you read a book, do you read it like I would read a book, or is it like?
No, I'm very different from you.
Because I've asked this question before, and some folks read it once, and then another time they'll go through, and then there's like lots of stickies, notes. They're kind of breaking down how that story was told. Is that something that you do, or is that you just read and kind of like it plays in your head?
Yeah, I'll just read and it plays in my head, and some things will like haunt me and I'll go back to them later. And sometimes I will like, I'm gonna fucking steal that. Sometimes I will take notes or highlight things on my Kindle, but often it's just like, you often learn more from things that you don't love than from things that you do, because when you're loving it, you're so immersed in the experience of it that you're not paying attention to craft, or at least I'm not. Whereas something that's like not so great, you're much more aware of what's going on, and so you can often see that more clearly and learn more from it. But yeah.
All right. I'll go to you, Paulo. So what advice would you give an emerging writer?
Well, it's following up on what you were just saying about what you can learn from things that are bad or things that you don't like particularly. I have had this moment where, you look at a bestseller and you're like, that is the dumbest bestseller in the universe. And then you like pause and you think, a lot of people like that. Like, what do I need to know about what that book is doing or what that story is doing? Like, it's doing one thing well. What's that superpower? Because I want to steal that superpower. I want that superpower for me, and I want to apply it to other things. And if you're sort of standing at a remove going, well, that's below me, that's garbage, you aren't seeing the power that it has, and you aren't able to like steal the thing that you could be using and turning to your own use. But as far as like, becoming a writer, as far as like, you just need a tolerance for failure that's just enormous. You need to have this enormous ego that says to you, like, I deserve to be seen, I deserve to be heard, I deserve to exist. And you also need a huge amount of humility to recognize that whatever you're writing is probably shit. And you're trying to find some way to meld those two things where you can improve yourself with your humility and recognize that, like, you need to keep improving. There's things you need to keep learning. There's things that you need to keep practicing. and then enough ego to just say, no, I'm going to continue. I'm going to turn out that next story. I'm going to submit again. Just because I was rejected the last time doesn't mean that I shouldn't learn from that and try a different story and a different attack and come back again and again relentlessly. And that learning process and that relentlessness is the thing that I sort of like, as opposed to any specific thing, it's just, that's sort of the mindset that you have to have if you're going to move forward.
So I'm going to go to you in a minute, but if folks want to ask questions, we'll turn it over to you all, and you can ask them some questions. So we'll have a Q&A session. There'll be a mic that will be coming through, and I guess you could either line up there or just hold your hand up, and we can get you a microphone. So same question to you, like as an emerging writer to another emerging writer, what would you offer up as some advice to kind of get that story out there?
I don't know. I can really give advice. I guess I would just encourage, like, especially folks from BIPOC communities. I feel like, unfortunately, it's still a radical thing to say that there will be Black and Indigenous people in 2200, and so your stories are so necessary. One, and two, I think, especially folks from like historically marginalized communities, we have a unique view of the climate crisis of one of several concurrent, ongoing, centuries-long crises that I think the solutions that we have to offer, the way that we frame them, are needed in our current discourse. And so would just say, like, please submit.
Right. Thank you for that. Yeah. So if anyone wants to come up and ask a question.
Can I just say a quick shout out? Because there's bright light in my face, so I'm not sure. Is that Lewis Evans out there? Lewis Evans is also in the anthology. A Satyr in Siberia was one of the stories that won. So everyone, nice. Applause for Lewis as well.
He's talking about the Imagine 2200 collection that we just dropped in January 23rd or something like that. It's not etched in my brain. We'll go to you. Does someone have a microphone?
Hi, Tori. Thank you so much. This is a question more about like Grist and Imagine 2200. Mm-hmm. We know we live in a world where many people aren't reading or can't read and aren't looking to words for their ideas or news or anything like that. What is Grist doing to engage people in other mediums for fiction? And how can we support that effort?
I'm producing this content. Like, so we know the interesting thing, when we started this, we didn't know if there would be an audience for this. We know that obviously people read books, there's fiction out there, but the kind of climate fiction that we're bringing, this culturally authentic, intersectional climate fiction that's sourced globally, and it's really scary to start something new, just like put it out there and, see if people like it. And what we found is that there is an audience for this and people are reading it. It's funny how you think of the internet that you can kind of like know what's going on, but I don't know all of, I know that there's numbers, there's people that are reading it. I see that, 60,000, 70,000 people visited the site. They stayed there for a certain amount of minutes. So that gives me hope that people do read. There are literate people out there reading and sharing this. One of the big things we did one of the impetus for doing this is to have discussions like this around climate. Like, not everyone gets their orientation from the news. It's funny saying that from a news organization, but like there's a lot of people who they read news, but fiction is more their thing, and we want to be talking to them about the climate from a variety of ways. We have fantasy and magical realism show up in some of the stories, and we wrangled with that for a while because we're very much a climate solutions news organization, but we're okay with that because it allows us to have a conversation with someone because that's where they are. So I want more climate fiction that just meets people where they are. So romance climate fiction, mystery climate fiction, let's just bust it open and there's just all different babies of climate fiction out there in the world. So I think I actually think people are pretty literate. There's a lot of misinformation out there, but people are reading constantly, on their phones. And, it's just we got to get more of this out there. So recently I've been saying we don't need 1,000 flowers to bloom. We need a million stories from different perspectives that are talking about how do we get out of this crisis? I hope that answered your question. Oh, right here? I can shout. Oh, it's all right. We have a mic.
Thank you. My question is, how do you stay positive in your writing? Because I think even when I look up sort of utopian fiction or things to watch or whatever, it sort of starts like positive, like, oh, this beautiful world in which everyone's equal and whatever, and then something bad happens, and then it's all in disarray. And I think that it just seems like we really love things going wrong. So how do you keep it on the trajectory of like things going right and make that exciting also? Because we also love being scared and thinking that everything's going to go bad. So how do you keep it pushing towards a positive ending and make that actually engaging for people?
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, just for me personally, like I hold two things in my hands at all times. One is like things can get better and people will still be garbage, right? So like even if we can make changes and we can see a more positive future in XYZ area, people will still be garbage, right? And so you can still see, the engine of narrative like is trouble, right? Is problems, is like, interpersonal conflict or things that people are grappling with. So I think that's what makes for great storytelling for me, is like, let's imagine positive, let's hope for better, but also let's bear in mind that people will have to live with these futures, and what's that going to look like, and how will people make sense of it, and they won't do great, but that could be fun.
We'll go to you, Paulo.
So the question, just to recap, is sort of how to create like a positive idea inside of fiction, even as you depict an accurate, screwed up future. And is that accurate? Is that what I'm understanding?
He wants you to repeat the question. I'm sorry.
If you could just summarize slightly.
To summarize, it's how do you make the idea of a positive future exciting for people?
Okay.
Because we don't really like stories that are just everything went fine. It was all fine.
Okay, so when I was working on a young adult book called Shipbreaker, and I really wanted to write an adventure story. I wanted to give young people something that was exciting to read. I wanted it to be engaging. I wanted it to be something that was thrilling. And I also wanted to be dead honest about just how devastating the climate future might be. And so the world that those young people inhabited was one that was devastated. It was set in the Gulf Coast. New Orleans had been completely drowned. The main character works as a shipbreaker, tearing apart an old oil tankers. But out on the ocean, he can see these beautiful clipper ships, and there's this new age of sail happening. And so there are these beautiful clipper ships. They've got high altitude parasails. They've got hydrofoils. It's sort of like as if you took the age of sail from the 1800s and then updated it and said, yes, let's have a global economy based on wind. But what can we do with it now that we have all of this knowledge about hydrodynamics and all this material science? And what would an age of sail now look like instead of one back that we already had successfully that was literally based on wooden boats and canvas? And so then you could tell a story about these kids working on this shipbreaking beach and trying to get out to those clipper ships. And that journey then becomes the inspiring part, that there's a better future, or there's a better way of living. And absolutely, there's a lot of devastation, but there is a better path. And that, for me, sort of worked.
Yeah, I think like this question is one that people are wrangling with, and excitement, adventure, journeys, those kind of can bring that sort of hope, so that it's not just this, again, we do accept utopian stories, but the ones that I think work in the kind of the hopeful way is where there's a journey, there's a quest, and the things that Paulo's talking about kind of move, and the characters move into like this beautiful, clean, green, and just world, but that's not where it started, you know. I think we have enough time, because we get extra time because it started late, for 3 more questions.
Could I ask
saw
one
that.
from the live stream audience?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. There's just one, so we can ask, so the other 2 people will still get theirs. I wonder if folks could talk about if and how they're integrating beyond human elements into their stories, like an animal or a river, as active agents or characters of the future.
Before they answer that question, I just want to say that we want more stories like that. So if you have a story percolating in your head, please submit that kind of story, because we'll take it. Does anyone want to answer that question?
I mean, I have an animal in all of my stories and all of my books, which is usually the tattoo I get for every book. Yeah, I mean, I think animals are amazing. I'm been a vegetarian for 27 years and an animal rights activist, and feeling like wanting to expand our understanding of what sentience is and what intelligence is, and our interconnectedness with all species, and plant life, and yes, all the things.
I saw that you had your hand up. I'll go to you.
Yeah. Hello. Well, hello. So I'm with this station Billion and Club and Cafe. So I know that we've been having a August L last year. Because the people are dying from the climate change, what they have, like, even though no like doing superstorm Sandy, that what we have, like, since 2012, what we have, like flooding, and then we have heat going on, and now it's sitting here entering the first day of spring right now. So my question is, what is a good idea to how we good idea and how we going to save planet?
I guess that is the question. I think, like, the great thing about fiction is that this active imagination that we have as humans, we can play out what we think, the roadmap to how we get out of there, or what the world will look like on the other side once we get past this crisis that we're in. So I definitely don't have the answer for that question, but I think we can play with that question in fiction, and I think that's the goal for Imagine 2200, is to have, those million flowers blooming across the world, where different people are thinking and talking about this, like, we really need to talk about this. And we need to talk about it from a variety of angles. I think there's people on the front lines that have frontline, folks that are living where the water is, like, actively changing their landscape right now, where heat is and fires are changing. They are resilient in looking at ideas and ways. I want those kind of folks to write stories about the solutions they found, about the ways that you live among each other in change. So I think that story is a good way to synthesize some of these ideas and also disperse them so that we can discuss them.
Should I wait for them?
Yeah, please. And then we'll do 2 more, because I know we're getting close to time.
My question, sort of a follow-up from Andrew's question, are you doing any sort of cross-industry work to amplify some of the fiction that you are gathering? So, for example, the Good Energy Playbook works within Hollywood to incorporate more climate stories. Is there any, like, collaborations of that nature, or anything to, even as you were just speaking now, we need as many folks and as many industries to help sort of propel the solution? So just curious if you're using these stories as a way to help build connections, or, like, find a way to amplify them even further.
Yeah, shout out to Good Energy and their playbook and what they've been doing to push and advocate for Hollywood to incorporate more climate plots and stories, narratives, and characters. We're open to it. We've definitely had conversations with folks in Hollywood. it's a tough business, like trying to get that going, and a lot of money. I guess the way I'll answer this is I think that Imagine 2200 and other projects like it are running ahead of the advocacy work that needs to be done that needs to advocate for more climate storytelling. And that climate storytelling is a climate solution that will help activate us and have us in rooms like this discussing climate with people who aren't motivated by news and facts and figures. It's more about emotion and depictions of the reality that we may have or the one that we want. So, talk about this, talk about how storytelling can get us there. And I'm going to stay out there advocating for this because the philanthropists and like those folks need to know that this is a climate solution, and it will be helpful to kind of change narratives and get these ideas out into the world. So unfortunately, I think we're running ahead of like where philanthropy is. We got one more. I think I saw his hand first. I'm sorry. And hopefully it's a question for someone other than me.
Yeah, it is. Hi. My question is, I know we talked about, or not me, you talked about kind of communities and how that's informed your writing. I think something that I'm seeing on the title of this event is For Future Ancestors, and I don't think we've talked about those people, those imaginaries at all. And I'm wondering, what does future ancestors mean for you?
Sure, I guess I can answer that one because managing the project. So the whole idea that we had around this was that, oh, you go ahead.
I wanted to ask it to the writers in terms of how they write in their craft and how they're imagining who they're writing for.
Okay.
And that idea of future ancestors.
Okay.
That's a really good question. I think in terms of who I'm writing for, right now it's both myself and my friends. I think the idea of being able to write stories where like the emotion of, or the weight of the climate crisis, I think is very prevalent. And so being able to write something that people can read and be like, yeah, same, I'm also feeling this way, for me is my motivation. In terms of future ancestors, I don't know that I've thought about that term deeply enough, but I think almost all of the people that I write about are based on myself or family members, and how I imagine us surviving, and not only surviving, but thriving and running shit. So, yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a better answer to that question, but yeah.
Do you want to?
I didn't enter this contest, so I just judged it. But to me, what I found really compelling about this idea of future ancestors is that's us, right? Like
Right.
we are future ancestors, and how will people look at us, right? Like, I imagine that future generations will be really unhappy with us, right? And that like, oh, why the fuck didn't they just do this really easy thing that would have so we have a lot of culpability here, but it's also nice to think about like, what are the things we can do to make people be like, oh yeah, well, the people who were alive in 2024 messed up a lot, but also they, there were these people doing these things that were like not garbage.
Right, and I think we'll close with that. I definitely want to thank NRDC one more time. Thank you so much for the support that you have offered. That is an organization that gets it around climate storytelling and is running just right with us as we deliver these stories. I want to thank the Center for Fiction for hosting us. And thank you all for having us. And thank you to this judges, panelists, authors. Thank you so much.
Oh my God, yeah.
How's that
My
going?
mother called 3 times during that. I was like, stop, 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 stop.